The chill morning air clung to the small village, a silent witness to a grim spectacle. In the center of the town square, a wooden stake stood tall, its rough surface gleaming in the pale sunlight. A body, lifeless and pale, was tied to it, the face contorted in a final, desperate struggle. The villagers, somber and distant, watched as the priest recited the final prayers, his voice barely a whisper against the heavy silence. This was the fate of those who chose to end their own lives. In the early modern period, suicide was not just a personal tragedy. It was a crime against God and society. The body of a suicide was often denied a proper burial, stripped of the dignity and peace that the living took for granted. Instead, it was left to rot in a lonely field, a stark reminder of the gravity of their sin. But as the centuries unfolded, the way society treated suicide began to change. In Geneva, a city known for its strict religious and moral codes, the treatment of those who took their own lives evolved in ways that mirrored broader changes across Europe. In the early 1600s, the small council, the governing body of Geneva, was unforgiving. For every suicide, the family faced a harsh judgment. The body was often buried outside the normal cemetery, without the traditional funerary rites that brought comfort to the grieving. No prayers, no procession, no mourning. It was a public statement, a symbol of divine disapproval and social condemnation. One such case was that of Ezekiel Revilliod, a 68-year-old former military officer from my prestigious family. In April 1736, Revilliod hanged himself after a long battle with an illness that his physician described as manic depression. The community was shocked, but the small council, led by John Donne, the Procureur General, showed a rare moment of leniency. Revilliod was allowed to be buried in the ordinary cemetery, but with strict conditions. Only 5 rows of relatives could attend, and no prayers were to be said at the interment. It was a small concession, a sign that the tide was turning. By the late 1700s, the small council's approach to suicide had softened considerably. After 1750, they were more interested in determining the cause of death than in punishing the deceased. Magistrates no longer saw suicide as a crime to be punished, but as a tragedy to be understood. They allowed full funerary rites for some suicides, while others were denied without much explanation. The focus shifted from punishment to prevention and understanding. The final turning point came in 1791. Gabriel George, an artist and painter, shot himself after suffering from deep melancholy and delirium. The small council made a historic decision. They denied full burial rites, but it was the last time they would do so. With the establishment of the new regime in 1792, the de facto decriminalization of suicide became official. The new Penal Code of 1791 did not mention suicide at all, effectively removing it from the realm of criminal law. The transformation was profound. What had once been a criminal act was now seen as a symptom of deeper societal and personal issues. The harsh penalties of the past were replaced with a more compassionate approach. In Geneva, as in many parts of Europe, the treatment of suicide had undergone a radical change, reflecting a broader shift in attitudes towards mental health and personal suffering. The morning sun slowly rose, casting a warm glow over the village square. The stake stood empty, a silent witness to a bygone era. The villagers, once so quick to judge, now looked to the future with a newfound understanding. The body of a suicide was no longer a symbol of shame, but a reminder of the complexities of the human spirit. Calvin, the famous Protestant reformer, had a lot to say about suicide, especially in his sermons and writings. In one of his sermons, based on Matthew 26, Calvin talked about Judas's suicide. He described how God's anger made Judas and other damned souls feel their sins so intensely that they were driven to despair and cried out in agony. However, Calvin believed that this despair wasn't a call to hope or to turn to God. It was more like a madness that pushed them to their end. Calvin wanted his listeners to see this as a warning and to reflect on their own lives, recognizing that without God's grace they too could fall into such despair. Calvin also wrote a preface to a book about Francesco Spira, an Italian man who hanged himself in 1548 after renouncing his Protestant faith. In this preface, Calvin criticized Italian Catholicism, but didn't offer much insight into his views on suicide itself. He was more focused on attacking the Catholic Church for its treatment of Protestants. Theologians and writers of the time, like Theodore de Bèze, also had their own stories. Some people thought Bèze had considered suicide, but that wasn't true. Bèze was just expressing his fear of dying from a serious illness. His letters show how he faced his fears with faith rather than considering self-harm. Another important figure, Lambert Deneau, wrote a book called Ethices Christianae in 1579. In it, he argued strongly against suicide, using a passage from Ephesians 5, which talks about husbands loving their wives as they love themselves. Deneau took this to mean that people should not take their own lives, though the passage was originally about marital love. In the Catholic Church, the Council of Trent produced a catechism that condemned all suicides. Various church councils in France, such as those in Lyon, Bordeaux, Cambrai, and Chartres, also banned the burial of suicides in church grounds. This was meant to discourage people from taking their own lives and to emphasize the seriousness of the sin. Thomas More, the famous English writer, also had strong views on suicide. In his book, Utopia, he described suicide as one of the most terrible fears a person could have, especially when the devil tempts them to end their own life. More's writings reflect the deep religious and moral concerns of his time. Montaigne, a French essayist, wrote about a custom on the island of Ca where people who were about to die by suicide were given a chance to explain their reasons. Montaigne's essays often explored complex human emotions, including the reasons why people might choose to end their lives. His writings influenced later thinkers, though some, like Pierre Charon, borrowed heavily from Montaigne's ideas. John Donne, the renowned English poet, wrote a controversial work called Biathanatos, in which he argued that suicide wasn't always a sin. Donne's views were quite different from those of his contemporaries, who generally saw suicide as a grave sin. However, Donne's ideas were not widely accepted at the time. In the 17th century, some thinkers started to show more sympathy for those who took their lives. Spinoza, a Dutch philosopher, argued that people who committed suicide were not acting out of free will, but were victims of their circumstances. This was a significant shift from the traditional view that saw suicide as a voluntary act of sin. Even as attitudes towards suicide began to change, many still believed that it was a grave sin. In 1724, Samuel Sewall, a Puritan judge in Massachusetts, argued that those who committed suicide should be denied Christian burials because their actions were influenced by the devil. This view was becoming less common, but it still had its supporters. In Geneva, the laws about suicide were complex. If someone took their own life, their property could be confiscated, but their children were still allowed to inherit a portion of it. This was meant to balance the need to punish the act with the need to protect the innocent. The treatment of suicide varied across Europe. In some places, like France, nobles and clergy were often exempt from punishment, while commoners were more likely to face harsh penalties. This reflected the social and class biases of the time. One example from Geneva shows how the authorities handled suicide attempts. In 1543, a woman named Jana tried to drown herself by wading into the lake while washing clothes. She was upset about financial problems and feared her husband's disapproval. Calvin and the consistory, the church council, simply admonished her to live honestly and recite her prayers. This gentle approach suggests that the authorities recognized the underlying emotional and social pressures that could lead to such actions. The way societies treated suicide reflects their deep religious and moral beliefs. In many places, the bodies of suicides were not given proper burials, and their property was confiscated. These practices were meant to deter others from taking their own lives and to emphasize the gravity of the sin. Over time, some thinkers began to see suicide in a more nuanced light, recognizing the complex emotional and social factors that could lead to it. However, the traditional view that suicide was a grave sin persisted for a long time, and the penalties for it remained severe in many places. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the way people thought about suicide was changing. Back then, the Protestant clergy believed that suicide was caused by supernatural forces, like demons or evil spirits. They couldn't completely stop these beliefs, so they decided to accept some of the popular practices that people used to deal with the supernatural aspects of suicide. This meant that even though suicide was considered a sin, the community still found ways to cope with it. As time went on, the authorities and communities started to treat suicide more harshly. They believed that if they punished suicide more severely, it would stop people from doing it. However, this might have had the opposite effect. Some researchers think that the more harshly suicide was treated, the more people tried to hide it. In places like Geneva, the strict rules against suicide had already become less strict by the time there was a big increase in suicide rates. One interesting case was that of Jean-Jacques-André Boissier, a man who was 49 years old and worked as an investigator. He had looked into several suicide cases himself, but one day, after suffering from illness and feeling very sad, he took his own life by drowning in October 1766. This shows that even people who dealt with suicide professionally could struggle with their own mental health. The way funerals were handled for people who committed suicide was also different. In Geneva, a funeral procession for a suicide was very quiet and discreet. The body was carried by prisoners, and it was buried at the end of the day. This was to avoid drawing attention to the suicide and to keep the community from feeling too upset. One of the most important people in Geneva who dealt with these issues was Jean-Philippe Desarts. He was a lawyer who held many important positions in the city. When a watchmaker named Pierre Morgue, who was very sad after his wife died, hanged himself, the city fined his estate 50 écus plus expenses. This was a way to punish the family for the suicide, even though the person who committed it was already gone. Another important figure was Jacques Martin, a lawyer who served in various roles in Geneva. He wrote a lot about why suicide was wrong, using ideas from ancient writers like Cicero and Horace. Martin believed that suicide was a wrong to society and to God, not just to the person who did it. He also talked about how the law, both civil and religious, condemned suicide. However, not everyone agreed with these strict views. Some philosophers, like Voltaire, thought that suicide could be justified in certain situations. Voltaire, a famous writer from the Enlightenment, wrote about how some people, like the Roman statesman Cato, chose to take their own lives to avoid a worse fate. He believed that sometimes ending one's life could be a brave and honorable act. Other writers, like Rousseau, also had complicated views on suicide. In his novel, Julie, or The New Heloise, he explored the idea of suicide as a way for lovers to be reunited in the afterlife. This shows that even though suicide was often seen as a sin, it could also be a topic of deep emotional and philosophical discussion. The way people thought about suicide continued to evolve over time. By the 18th century, some people started to see it as a medical issue rather than just a moral one. This shift in thinking helped to change the way society treated those who were struggling with mental health issues. In Geneva, the way suicide was handled reflected a complex mix of religious, legal, and social attitudes. The city tried to balance the need to punish suicide with the desire to support the families left behind. This shows that even in a time of strict rules, there was still room for compassion and understanding. In early modern Geneva, people who took their own lives did so for a variety of reasons. To understand why the number of suicides increased dramatically in the late 18th century, we need to look closely at the lives of the people who committed suicide. This chapter explores who these people were and what pushed them to take such a drastic step. From the first records until the French Revolution, Geneva's authorities tried to figure out not only if a death was a suicide, but also what caused it. They looked at the person's character, mental and physical health, and any recent personal problems. In the late 18th century, many people left suicide notes, which often explained why they did it. Some scholars, like Emil Durkheim, believe that suicide is a social phenomenon, and that the real reasons are not personal but societal. Durkheim thought that the supposed motives are just what officials believe, based on the person's background. He trusted officials to identify suicides, but not to understand why they happened. Other scholars argue that both social and personal reasons are important. Family feelings, religious beliefs, and attitudes toward wealth all play a role in why people might choose to end their lives. We have to be careful when looking at the evidence from witnesses and suicide notes. Sometimes, people in the past believed that demons or mental illness were the reasons. For example, Elizabeth Pascal, who jumped to her death in 1625, was said to be tormented by demons. But the evidence also shows she had mental health issues and was in conflict with her husband. Another case is a young chambermaid who drowned herself in 1614. Her mistress said she often talked about the devil, but other witnesses said the mistress was verbally abusive. Even if the evidence isn't always reliable, it can show how people's thinking changed over time. For instance, in one era, people might blame demons, while in another, they might see mental illness as the cause. This change shows a shift from religious to more medical and secular views on suicide. If we find many suicides in one period motivated by romantic despair, but none in another, it means that society was starting to place more importance on love. Based on the criminal proceedings and the records of the small council, I identified plausible motives for 358 out of 404 suicides. Many people who committed suicide were suffering from physical illness, depression, or a sense of isolation. Some were in prison or trying to avoid arrest and punishment. A significant number of suicides were related to family issues, such as the death of a loved one, romantic problems, conflicts between generations, and pregnancies outside of marriage. In the late 18th century, Geneva was undergoing significant changes. The city was becoming more secular, and people were starting to think differently about suicide. Mental illness was seen as a more acceptable reason, and the stigma around suicide was decreasing. This shift in thinking might explain why the number of suicides increased. By understanding the motives behind these suicides, we can see how the social, economic, and political changes in Geneva influenced people's decisions. The growing importance of individualism and the changing attitudes toward mental health and family life all played a role in this complex phenomenon. In early modern Geneva, the city was a unique blend of political structure and economic activity, forming a society quite different from what we know today. The city was not a democracy. Instead, it was ruled by a small group of wealthy and powerful people. These rulers, known as the oligarchy, made all the important decisions, and they didn't like to share power with anyone else. They believed they had a duty to take care of the poor, but they were very strict about who could have a say in how the city was run. The people of Geneva were divided into different groups based on their political status. At the top were the citizens and bourgeois, who were the only ones with full rights. Citizens were people born in Geneva to parents who were already citizens or bourgeois. Bourgeois, on the other hand, were people who had to buy a special document called a lettre de bourgeoisie to become part of this group. Both citizens and bourgeois could work in high-paying jobs like being an attorney, banker, or merchant. They were the only ones who could vote and hold important positions in the city government. Below the citizens and bourgeois were the habitants and the tiefs. Habitants were foreigners who were allowed to live and work in Geneva, but they had to leave a deposit with the city, and their residency could be revoked at any time. Natives were people born in Geneva to parents who were habitants. They had a few more rights, like being able to buy a lettre de bourgeoisie at a lower price, but they still couldn't vote or hold important positions. At the bottom were the foreigners, sujets, and others who had very few rights. Foreigners were people from other places who were just passing through or living in Geneva temporarily. Sujets were people who lived in the surrounding villages that belonged to Geneva, but they couldn't live in the city unless they got special permission. These groups had almost no say in how the city was run. As time went on, it became harder and harder for people to become part of the bourgeoisie. The cost of a lettre de bourgeoisie skyrocketed, making it almost impossible for most people to afford. This meant that the number of citizens and bourgeois decreased, while the number of natifs and foreigners increased. By the late 1700s, only a small fraction of the people living in Geneva had the right to vote. In terms of jobs, Geneva was a place where people worked a lot. Most men were involved in some kind of production, whether it was farming, building, or making goods. Farming was a small part of the economy, as Geneva was a city, but there were still some farmers and gardeners. Many people worked in the construction industry, building houses and other structures. Others worked with metals, making tools and weapons. There were also many artisans who made clothes, shoes, and other items for the local market. The city was also known for its export industries, especially in textiles. The wool industry was one of the longest lasting, with workers carding, spinning, weaving, and dyeing wool to make clothes and other goods. The silk industry was even bigger, with workers making silk thread, knitting silk hose, and producing luxury items like velvet and taffeta. The most important part of the silk industry was the production of passementerie, which are fancy decorations for clothes and furniture. Later, the city became famous for making indiennes, which were colorful printed cotton fabrics. This industry was different because it used factory-style production, with many workers doing different tasks in one place. Over time, the textile industries started to decline, and people began to find work in other areas. The city's economy changed, and so did the social structure. Despite these changes, the political system remained the same, with the wealthy and powerful few continuing to control the city. Understanding the social and economic structure of early modern Geneva helps us see why some people might have felt more or less likely to take their own lives. The poor and downtrodden didn't always have the most suicides, and some wealthy people also ended their lives, showing that material well-being wasn't a guarantee of happiness or mental health. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Geneva's most important export was textiles. However, by the 18th century, the city's economy shifted, and a new industry called La Fabrique took over. La Fabrique involved the production of goods made with jewelry or precious metals, such as watches and goldsmithing. It's interesting to note that Geneva's focus on jewelry and precious metals began despite the strict moral rules of the Reformed Church, led by John Calvin and Theodore Beza. They discouraged people from showing off their wealth and removed all the ornate decorations from churches. Despite this, religious refugees from France, Italy, and Flanders came to Geneva and started working as goldsmiths, lapidaries, and engravers. This brought a significant boost to the jewelry trade in the late 1500s. One of the key industries that developed was gilding, which involved creating gold and silver threads to decorate textiles like braids, lace, and brocades. By the late 17th century, gilding employed many men and women. Watchmaking. Another important part of La Fabrique also began to grow. The first watchmakers in Geneva formed a guild in 1601, and by the 18th century, watchmaking had become a major industry. By 1788, Geneva was producing about 1/6 of the world's watches. In the early days, watchmaking was a traditional artisanal industry where a master watchmaker and his helpers would make a watch from start to finish in one shop. However, by the 18th century, the industry became more complex. Master watchmakers started to outsource tasks like polishing and making chains to other workers. The guild rules also became stricter, making it harder for new people to join the ranks of master watchmakers. Despite these changes, the industry remained based on skilled artisans and was regulated by a guild. La Fabrique became the most prestigious and lucrative work for artisans in early modern Geneva. By the 18th century, many watchmakers were making a good living. They often owned their own homes and even had servants. Some invested in land and other financial assets, becoming quite wealthy. While La Fabrique and watchmaking were the most profitable, there were other important jobs in Geneva. About a quarter to a third of the male workforce was involved in service jobs such as grocers, wine and cheese vendors, and those who ran taverns, cafes, and inns. These jobs were essential for the city's survival, even though they employed a smaller percentage of the population compared to La Fabrique. The elite in Geneva included merchants and people in the liberal professions, such as lawyers and clergymen. These were the wealthiest inhabitants and held the most powerful positions in the city. Some merchants traded textiles, jewelry, and watches, while others were involved in long-distance trade. The liberal professions included educators, artists, and health professionals like physicians and apothecaries. These jobs usually made up about 5% of the active male population. At the bottom of the social scale were soldiers, unskilled workers, and domestic servants. These jobs didn't require formal training or licenses and paid very little. The political status of individuals determined which jobs they could do. Until 1670, non-citizens like habitants and natifs could work in most professions, including commerce. However, from 1670 to 1720, their economic rights were restricted. They were excluded from commerce and the most lucrative artisanal jobs, unless they received special permission. By the end of the 18th century, non-citizens gradually regained their economic rights, and by 1792, all class barriers were removed. Despite the protectionist measures, the elite professions were not as closed as the laws suggested. Many non-citizens, especially wealthy Huguenots, were allowed to work in these fields. The bourgeoisie, who made up a significant portion of the population, dominated the most prestigious jobs, but non-citizens also found ways to succeed. The natives, who were born in Geneva but not part of the elite, were the main artisanal class. They were heavily involved in la fabrique and other crafts. The habitants, who were foreign-born, were more diverse. Some were very wealthy and worked in elite professions, while others did humble jobs like construction and agriculture. By the end of the 18th century, the social and economic structure of Geneva had changed significantly. The bourgeoisie focused on the most lucrative jobs, while the natifs and habitants worked in a range of occupations from the prestigious to the humble. This diversity in jobs and social status shaped the city's economy and society during the early modern period. The economic boom that Geneva experienced from 1730 to 1785 didn't benefit everyone equally. If the assets described in marriage contracts are any indication, the citizens and bourgeois generally enjoyed a significant increase in their standard of living. This increase was especially noticeable for those in the most lucrative professions, such as commerce and the liberal professions, where the average assets at the time of marriage increased by over half. However, not everyone benefited equally. The natifs and habitants, who were less homogeneous in the later part of the 18th century, faced different challenges. In the 1770s, the habitants and foreigners had a larger proportion of poor people compared to the natives. Wealthy habitants, though, continued to outnumber affluent natifs. Among the natifs, the number of the poorest and the richest increased by the 1770s compared to 1700. The changes in wealth were also linked to different professions. People in humble jobs like agriculture, provisioning, woodworking, construction, and the military saw a decrease in their standard of living. Artisans in textiles, clothing, and metallurgy, on the other hand, experienced a substantial gain, with their standard of living increasing by more than 30%. Watchmakers and goldsmiths, who had the highest assets in the early 1700s, saw only a modest increase by the 1770s, even though their assets were still higher than other artisans. The natives also saw a shift in their workforce, with more people moving into la fabrique and fewer in agriculture, construction, woodworking, and the military. Despite the overall economic growth, the gap between the rich and the poor widened. The bourgeoisie benefited the most, while those in the humblest professions became poorer. This economic inequality had a significant impact on the social structure and may have contributed to the rise in suicides, especially among those who were feeling the strain of financial hardship. The background of early modern Genevan society helps us understand the breakdown of suicides by occupation and political and financial status. Sociologist Emile Durkheim suggested that high social status and low external restraint were associated with higher suicide rates. More recent studies indicate that people in more remunerative professions, like business management, are more likely to commit suicide than those in crafts and manual labor. Andrew, Henry, and James Short argued that economic crises which change people's social ranking and thwart their goals can lead to frustration and aggression, sometimes directed inward as suicide. In Geneva, the data on suicides shows that the political status of those who took their lives varied. Leaving aside the 16 suicides whose status was unknown, about a third of the suicides were citizens or bourgeois, and a quarter were foreigners. However, the Revolution of December 1792 changed the political landscape. granting citizenship to all habitants and natifs. This means that the economic advantages citizens had before the revolution might have carried over, affecting the suicide rates. When we look at the data for the entire early modern period, citizens and bourgeois, natifs and foreigners each made up about a quarter of the suicides. Habitants made up about 15% and sujets about 10%. The data for male and female suicides showed some differences. A higher percentage of male suicides were citizens or bourgeois, while a higher percentage of female suicides were foreigners. Foreigners, habitants, and sujets were represented more or less proportionally in the suicides, especially among males. Foreigners, who were less integrated into Genevan society, made up a significant portion of the suicides. Sujets, who were underrepresented in the city but overrepresented in the dependent territories, were slightly underrepresented among suicides when the rural population was considered. Habitants, who made up more than 15% of the population from the 1690s on, were also underrepresented among suicides. The bourgeoisie, who made up about a quarter of all suicides, were underrepresented in the early Reformation period but overrepresented in the late 18th century. This suggests that the economic and social changes over time affected the suicide rates of different groups. To understand the financial status of suicides, we need to look beyond political categories. Criminal proceedings and post-mortem inventories provide valuable insights. For example, all servant girls and soldiers other than officers were of very humble means, while members of the Council of 200 in the small council were affluent. Landlords, servants, co-workers, relatives, and neighbors often provided information about the financial status of suicides. Post-mortem inventories, which became more common in the second half of the 18th century, show that the financial status of suicides varied. Of the 404 definite suicides, about 13% were clearly affluent, 42% were poor, and 45% were of modest to comfortable means. Female suicides tended to be poorer than male suicides. For example, Fanchette Dupont, a servant girl, left assets worth only 214 florins, while Jean-Louis Tronchin, an attorney from a wealthy family, left 72,000 livres. The data also show variations over time. In the Reformation period and the late 18th century, about 10% of suicides were affluent, which is probably in line with their share of the population. In the late 17th and early 18th century, the wealthy were overrepresented among suicides, possibly due to the growing gap between the rich and the poor. Despite this, suicide remained relatively rare until the mid-18th century. The political status of suicides up to 1750 also differed from the later period. Foreigners were more prominent among suicides in the 2 centuries before 1750. For women, this trend was even more pronounced, with many female suicides being domestic servants, most of whom were foreign-born. These insights into the financial and political status of suicides in early modern Geneva help us understand the social and economic factors that contributed to this tragic phenomenon. The economic boom, while benefiting some, left many behind, and the resulting social tensions may have played a role in the rise of suicides. Throughout the 2 centuries we've explored, the story of suicide in Geneva is a complex one, filled with surprising twists and turns. One of the most striking findings is the high number of citizens and bourgeois who chose to take their own lives. Despite being a relatively small group, they committed suicide more frequently than other social groups, except for foreigners. This is even more surprising when we consider that these individuals were often wealthy and politically influential. On the other hand, the natives, who made up a significant portion of the population, rarely took their own lives. This suggests that political integration played a significant role in the risk of suicide. When we look at the financial status of those who committed suicide, a clear pattern emerges. Among the citizens and bourgeois, over half were wealthy, while among the less privileged groups like habitants, sujets, and foreigners, the poor were more common. This dichotomy highlights the social and economic divides that influenced people's decisions to end their lives. For women, the picture is a bit different. The records show that many women who committed suicide were not married and did not live with their parents. This could mean that they were more independent and perhaps more vulnerable to the pressures of life. Women's work, especially in the early modern period, was often unrecorded or not recognized. However, we know that many women contributed significantly to the household economy. Working in domestic service, textile industries, and retail, by the end of the 16th century, however, women's economic opportunities began to decline as guilds and master craftsmen tightened their control over trades, gradually excluding women from higher-level positions. One area where women's work was consistently recognized was in domestic service. Over the 250 years we examined, 24 female servants took their lives. While the number of suicides among servants increased in the late 18th century, the proportion of servants among all female suicides decreased. This suggests that suicide was no longer limited to the economically marginalized, but began to affect a broader range of women. When we turn to the occupations of male suicides, we see a wide variety of professions represented. Surprisingly, those in service sectors, like provisioning, were overrepresented among suicides, even though they made up a smaller portion of the workforce. On the other hand, men in the dynamic sectors of Geneva's economy, such as textiles and watchmaking, were less likely to commit suicide. This is intriguing as these sectors were crucial to Geneva's economic success. Another notable finding is the relatively low number of suicides among soldiers. Despite the military often being associated with high rates of suicide, only a handful of soldiers took their lives over the 2 centuries. This could be due to the changing nature of Geneva's military needs and the overall decline in the threat of invasion. Most striking of all is the large number of wealthy merchants who committed suicide, especially in the early 18th century. These men, who enjoyed wealth, political clout, and prestige, seemed to be particularly vulnerable. However, the reasons behind their suicides were not often tied to economic or business issues. Instead, cultural factors, such as the pressures of maintaining a high social status, may have played a more significant role. In summary, the story of suicide in Geneva is a tale of social, economic, and cultural dynamics. It shows us how different groups in society were affected by the pressures of their times, and how these pressures sometimes led to tragic outcomes. By understanding these patterns, we gain a deeper insight into the lives of people in the past and the complex forces that shaped their choices.